the critical work taking place on many fronts. Personally, I appreciate the openness and honesty you shared about your journeys and what it will take to crack open some very closed mindsets and dare to have the uncomfortable conversations. Now it is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, who's very, very familiar with uncomfortable conversations. She knows how to get the information out to the rest of the world. We're talking about Laura Ling. Laura has dedicated herself to exposing critical global issues, including slave labor in the Amazon, the drug war in Mexico, internet censorship in China, and women's rights in Turkey. As the Director of Development for Discovery Digital Networks, Ling oversees the creation and production of original web series. She's also the host of Going Off Grid and Rituals with Laura Ling. Ling previously hosted documentary series on the E! Network that investigated topics like teen suicide. Ling's work at Current TV was recognized with the Alfred I. DuPont Award, and at SoCal Connected, she was recognized with an Emmy and the Edward R. Murrow Award. I think you can catch the theme here. It's a theme of excellence and digging. In March 2009, Ling captured the world's attention when she was arrested and imprisoned in North Korea after attempting to report on the trafficking of North Korean women. Her experience was documented in North Korea and was documented in her 2010 memoir, Somewhere Inside, One Sister's Captivity in North Korea and the Other's Fight to Bring Her Home, written with her sister, Lisa. Now, we have a live chat going during this symposium, so if you have a question for Laura, go ahead and type it into the chat box and she'll get to answering at least some of those toward the end of her remarks. And with that, we welcome Laura Ling.
Hi Gillian. Hi everyone on this call. Thank you so much for that introduction, Gillian. Thank you for leading that wonderful panel, Dr. Golar. I got so much out of it, and I just feel so thrilled to be a part of this virtual symposium. It's not often when you get to spend a morning or an afternoon with such a group of inspiring women who are advocating for change on so many levels, talking about addressing institutional racism, allyship, supporting young women and girls. I know, Anna, that you mentioned that it's not just the the Girl Scout cookies, but I will say that when you were mentioning that, I had to bring out my my many boxes here, and in support of the Girl Scouts. So also, thank you to Optimus Health for providing medical care services and hope to so many people across 30 health center sites and the critical work you're doing to support and empower women and girls. Speaking of hope, I would like to use this short time that I have with you all to talk about hope. Hope and action and the importance of building and fostering a common humanity. First, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in a suburb outside of Sacramento, California. It was a pretty all-American, pretty cookie-cutter community. There weren't many kids in my neighborhood that looked like my sister Lisa and me. It was pretty non-diverse. I would say that in our high school of 2,000 or so students, there were probably about 6 Asians, 2 of whom came from the same family, ours. And so I felt out of place. Kids would make fun of me for the shape of my eyes. They would comment that my house always smelled like fried rice when they came over. I just really felt uncomfortable and different in my own skin. But that all changed when I went to college. I landed at UCLA, also known as the University of Caucasians Lost Amongst Asians, and which was pretty true. But this whole world of diversity opened up to me, and it was so exhilarating. I met peers from so many different walks of life. My 4 closest friends during my freshman year in college, one was a young gay man who hadn't yet come out to his family. Another was a young Latino man who was the first in his family to go to college. Another was a deeply religious Christian young woman, and a young Korean American woman who remains my best friend to this day. And it was really this thrilling time to experience a deeper connection to other cultures and people, including my own culture and identity. And I think that being exposed to so much diversity was one of the reasons why I wanted to pursue journalism. I knew that I wanted to continue to immerse myself in different situations, meet people of different backgrounds, and to share those stories with others. And so over the past 25 years, I feel very fortunate to have been able to work as a journalist, traveling all around the world and across the US, reporting on various issues. And one of the areas that I've been particularly interested in reporting on over the years has been the struggle for freedom. So many of the people I have met along the way have moved and inspired me and have really shaped my worldview. From women in the Arab world speaking out for greater rights, to brave Ukrainians forging a new future for themselves, to US servicemen and women who have fought bravely for our country but who now face their own trauma. And I don't think I ever truly understood what a luxury our freedom is until I went out into the world and met, and across the US, and met these people who had risked their lives for greater freedom. And of course, until I lost my own. In March of 2009, I was in northeastern China meeting another group of people that have faced incredible odds. These are women who have fled their homeland in North Korea and that country's brutal regime where hunger is widespread, where even the most basic of rights is being denied. But rather than finding freedom across the border in China, many find themselves caught up in a different kind of desperation. Many women are sold into marriages to Chinese men. Others are lured into the prostitution industry. I interviewed a young woman from North Korea. She was in her 20s, and she had recently been trafficked from North Korea into China. She said that back in her homeland, the situation was very dire. She was only allowed to eat meat about 3 times a year on very special occasions. Food was scarce. She said that she had heard from a trafficker, a smuggler, that she could find work across the border in China working with computers. And so she thought she would maybe do some clerical work to help her family. After she was being smuggled across the border, she did find that she was placed in a job working with computers. It just wasn't quite as she expected. She was forced to chat with men online and undress for them via webcam. She held her arms behind her back to demonstrate the way in which her bosses tied her up to keep her from leaving the room in which she was being held. Tears streamed down her face when she talked about how much she missed her mother. On the morning of March 17th, tomorrow will be the anniversary, St. Patrick's Day. My team and I were filming along the frozen Tumen River. This is the river that separates China and North Korea. It was not our intention that morning to cross into North Korea, but we did want to document the thoroughfare where so many people and women are being trafficked across. And we were there with a local guide. Journalists working overseas will often hire local guides who we refer to as our fixers. These are people who work with international media. They know the issue, they know the area. And so that morning, our guide took us to the Tumen River. The river was still frozen, and we carefully stepped foot on that ice. At the time, I was working for Current TV, which is the cable channel that was co-owned by former Vice President Al Gore. I was the Vice President of the News and Documentary Division, and I was working on this story as a correspondent. And so while we were on that ice, I was talking to the camera, essentially explaining what happens on that river, especially during the winter months when the river is still frozen, because it's much easier to walk across the frozen ice than to wade across that river. And as I was talking to the camera, we noticed that our guide, our fixer, was walking toward the other side of the river, and he was motioning for us to follow him. And we did. We followed him across that river. We got to the other side. We were there for about a minute. We got a few shots and he turned around when we left. And it was about halfway across that river when I heard yelling. I turned around and I saw two North Korean soldiers with their rifles raised, and they were running toward us, and we just ran for our lives. I remember that I was just about to run back onto Chinese soil when my boot struck the edge of the ice, causing me to fall over. I had to use every bit of will and energy to pick myself up, but I did, and I continued to run. But I just was so overcome with fear that I felt the weight of the world pulling me down, and my legs just buckled. My colleague Yuna, who was behind me, as she was about to pass me, she stopped to see if I was okay. And that's when these two soldiers were upon us. My producer, Mitch, and our fixer were able to get away. So these soldiers were very determined to get us into North Korea. We were determined to stay in China. I tried to do everything that I could to just make my body as heavy as it could be, lying on the ground, grasping at weeds, at rocks, at the dirt, anything that I could get my hands on. The soldier who was dragging me was particularly forceful. He continued to kick me in the head, the shoulder, the jaw, over and over until he managed to eventually drag me onto that ice. And as he was dragging me across that river, I remembered that I still had a wireless microphone that was attached to my sweater, and I wondered if my producer, Mitch, could hear me. Mitch, I said into the microphone, I think I'm going to die. At that moment, I looked up at the soldier. He brought the butt of his gun down on my head, and I blacked out immediately. Now, as I mentioned, at the time of my capture, I was a young executive. I loved my job. I felt like everything in my life was on the right track. And then, in an instant, everything changed. When I came to after being knocked unconscious, I was in total shock. I didn't know if I would ever see my family again. I didn't know if I would survive until the next day. I felt as though I was living this out-of-body experience. The next 5 months would become the most challenging, frightening time of my life. And while that experience is filled with terrifying moments, from being beaten and dragged across that border to being interrogated, threatened with death, accused of trying to bring down the North Korean government, to eventually being sentenced to 12 years hard labor in one of North Korea's notorious labor camps. I would like to take a moment to share with you all some of the glimmers of humanity and compassion that I also experienced. Excuse me. One day, one of my guards had gone home to visit with her family, and when she came back to this compound in which I was being held, she asked if I had a nice time visiting. I asked if she had a nice time visiting with her family, and she looked a little bit confused, and she said, I did, but I feel bad that you've been separated from your family for so long. Another guard, after learning that I'd just been sentenced to 12 years hard labor, seemed genuinely shocked and saddened for me. I was huddled up in a corner of the room crying uncontrollably, and she came up to me and she said something that I'll never forget. Laura, she said, always have hope. Now, these are young women who were cold and mean and intimidating to me when I first met them. They looked at me as their enemy. And I looked at them as perfect models of North Korea's propaganda machine, because they were always quick to spew anti-US rhetoric, and they spoke about their leader as if he were this otherworldly godlike figure. But I mention these moments because I do think that they're a testament to what can happen when people from enemy nations, or really opposite ends of a spectrum, Black, white, Asian, when we get a chance to interact and communicate, our perceptions of one another can grow and widen. If we only take that chance to engage with those we consider different, we might learn how much we have in common, right? Now, it is a little odd to be known as one of the journalists Bill Clinton rescued from North Korea. But a lot of people ask me, why was it President Clinton? Why was he the person that served as the envoy for our release? And I always say the simple answer is that North Korean leader Kim Jong-il had just always wanted to meet him. But I later learned that there was actually some truth to that. But it may have had to do with something that happened many years prior. So when I was on the plane ride home with President Clinton and his team, President Clinton told me that when he met with North Korean leader Kim Jong-il, Kim told Clinton that when Kim's father, Kim Il-sung, passed away in 1994, so this was 15 years prior, President Clinton was the first leader to call Kim to offer his condolences, even before Kim's own allies. Kim told Clinton that he'd always remembered that kind gesture and had wanted to meet him ever since. And so I just think it is so wild to think that a possible reason for our release from North Korea can be traced back to that simple phone call that happened so many years ago. And it's a reminder that the things we do today have ripple effects that can impact our lives and others in ways that can be hard to imagine. About a year after my return from North Korea, I began working for the E Network. And some of you who are familiar with E might think that that was a little bit of an odd choice to go work for this entertainment channel. And to tell you the truth, I thought the same thing. I thought, what do they want me to do? Like report on the dating life of the Kardashians? It doesn't seem like the right fit for me. But I was pleasantly surprised when they asked me to report on issues impacting young Americans. And I thought that if just a fraction of the audience tunes in to a documentary about teenage depression, then maybe I can have a small impact. And it was actually that story on teen suicide and depression that was one of the more emotional stories I've covered in my career, because I was looking at that issue as a new mom. I got pregnant pretty quickly after I returned from North Korea. If you do the math, it was probably the day I returned. But I was looking at that issue through the lens of being a new mother and as someone who had once contemplated taking my own life during my captivity in North Korea. And when I went out to report on that story, I was shocked by the number of young people who talked about the feelings of depression that they face, from being bullied to being broken up with, to feeling just utterly stressed out and confused about their futures. What's crazy is that since then, the rates of teen sadness, especially among girls, has skyrocketed and gotten so much worse. But our report, I was at Talawanda High School in Oxford, Ohio, meeting a group of high school students, and nearly every single person, young person I spoke with, said that they felt depressed, but they were too embarrassed to talk about it because it was this admission of failure. Our story was meant to let them know that they are not alone and that there is help. Some of us here on this call may be going through circumstances that have left us feeling alone, confused, even depressed. In fact, I'd be shocked to know if there's anyone in this virtual gathering that hasn't felt some of these emotions during the last few years of a pandemic. It's also no surprise that the pandemic has disproportionately impacted women. from job losses, extreme caregiving challenges, and women continue to face a pay gap in nearly every occupation. Our country is also experiencing a period of deep division. Reported hate crimes are at the highest level they've been at in over a decade, with many more incidents going unreported. Throughout these last few years, I have often reflected back on my experience in captivity. A wound on my head is a constant reminder of the day I thought I might die. But that darkest period was also the biggest test of my strength. I meditated, I exercised as much as I could to keep my spirits and my energy up, and I strategized. I knew that I couldn't just sit around each day and wait for somebody to decide my fate. I tried to engage my captors every chance I could to try to figure out what was necessary to get us home. I do believe that it is often these unforeseen circumstances, life's many detours, that teach us the greatest lessons about ourselves, that force us to lead and take charge of our lives. And no matter how difficult things get, we just have to, as my North Korean guard once told me, hold on to hope. It will lead us through to brighter days. One of the things I did to get through each day and to maintain hope was to practice the act of gratitude. This became a ritual of mine during my captivity, and I'd like to share a little bit about it with you. Every night before I went to sleep, I would sit cross-legged and I would think about something that happened in that day that I actually felt grateful for, despite the bleak situation I was in. So I would say to myself, for example, I feel lucky I saw a butterfly outside the window, even though I can't leave this compound and breathe the fresh air. I feel fortunate I got 3 meals today, even though the portions were meager, because they were probably more than what the average North Korean was getting. I feel lucky my interrogator didn't threaten or berate me today. He was actually kind. Thinking about those small things allowed me to get on to the next day, and it's something that I continue to do to this day. I find that it can bring a sense of not only peace, but of purpose. And so before I go to sleep this evening, I will express my sincere thanks and gratitude for being able to spend this afternoon with all of you. People wonder if I'm scarred, whether I suffer from PTSD. I get the occasional panic attack, but more than anything, I really just feel so incredibly lucky to be home and to be free. And so I can only look at each new day as this precious little treasure. I want to do things that have meaning. I want to make my children proud. A few years ago, I worked on a documentary project for Discovery Communications about the science and power of kindness. I met with people whose lives have been transformed by random acts of kindness, and I'm not just talking about the people on the receiving end, but the givers, the people performing those kind acts. Scientists talked about the many benefits, including the tremendous physical and health benefits we experience when we are kind, even leading to longer lives. So many possibilities open up when empathy is our guide. Every one of us here in this virtual room has the ability to make a positive difference in our communities and in our society. As President Clinton demonstrated in that phone call to Kim Jong-il, even the smallest action can have a huge impact. It can change lives, it can save lives. Our unalienable right, our freedom, is a non-existent concept for others. Some risk their lives to experience the liberties we enjoy. Others will never know what freedom is. And so I ask you, how can we truly take ownership of our liberty, to seize it and value it, not just as a basic right, but as a responsibility? I'd like to close with a verse from a poem that I recited nearly every day of my captivity. Some of you here may know it. It's from the late, great Dr. Maya Angelou. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. There are too many people in this world, in our country, living as caged birds, where people are unable to express themselves freely, where criticizing their leadership could land them in prison, where they don't have the right to vote, to people who are going through their own personal tragedies, who feel caged in, trapped, and alone. I urge us all here to cherish the freedoms that we have and to continue to be strong, powerful voices for those who so desperately need one. Thank you all so much for having me. It has been an honor to be included in this group of inspiring women and to be a part of this conversation. And now I believe Dr. Golar will be joining me with a few questions that she has and questions that may have come up in the chat.
Thank you, Laura. You're absolutely right. And I have to say,